Ethan Hale stood in front of the large bay window, staring out at the gray mist that rolled through the countryside. His once pristine home, nestled in a remote, wooded area just outside town, now felt like a tomb. The heavy oak furniture and rich, dark walls that had once been a refuge from the world now seemed to close in on him. He sipped the whiskey in his hand, feeling the burn slide down his throat, but it did little to quiet the gnawing unease in his chest. It had been a year since she was gone. Sarah. Her name tasted bitter in his mouth, yet it was impossible to erase her from his mind. They had been married for 7 years, and their relationship had started like a fairy tale, full of passion, laughter, and promises. But as time passed, cracks formed, and their life together descended into something far darker. Arguments had become routine, venomous exchanges that left him seething with resentment. And then, one evening, everything changed. That night haunted him. He had come home late, drunk, the sour stench of bourbon clinging to him. Sarah had been waiting in the living room, her eyes red from crying, her words sharp like blades. She accused him of being unfaithful, of not loving her anymore, and in that heated moment, something inside Ethan snapped. He couldn't even remember the details of how it happened. The argument had turned violent, his hands on her throat, the look of terror in her eyes as he squeezed. But Sarah didn't die that night. Not exactly. Ethan buried her in the woods behind their house, deep enough that no one would find her. He covered the grave with rocks and branches, telling himself it was over, that she was gone, and his life would continue. But it hadn't. In the weeks and months following her disappearance, Ethan's mind began to unravel. It started with small things, her scent lingering in the bedroom, the faint sound of her laughter echoing in the hallways. He dismissed these as figments of guilt, his mind playing tricks on him. But the hallucinations grew worse. At night, he would wake to the sensation of her sitting on the edge of the bed, her weight dipping the mattress. He could hear her voice whispering his name in the dark, feel her icy breath on his neck. It was when he began seeing her that the true terror set in. The first time had been in the kitchen. He had been slicing vegetables for dinner, trying to resume a semblance of normalcy, when he glanced up and saw her standing in the doorway. She looked exactly as she had in life, tall, slender, with dark, flowing hair, but her eyes were empty, soulless, staring at him with silent accusation. He dropped the knife, his heart pounding, but when he blinked, she was gone. From that moment, Sarah's ghost became a constant presence. Ethan tried to escape her. He left the house for weeks at a time, staying at hotels, but no matter where he went, she followed. He would see her reflection in the mirror, hear her voice behind him, feel her cold touch at the most unexpected moments. She was always there, just out of reach, her ghostly figure a reminder of what he had done. His friends had all but abandoned him, his strange behavior, the paranoia, the wild look in his eyes when he spoke of Sarah drove them away. The isolation only deepened his madness. The town had whispered when Sarah disappeared. He had told them she'd left him, packed her things, and vanished into the night. No one had doubted it at first, but as time passed, and she remained missing, rumors began to swirl. Ethan could feel the judgmental eyes of his neighbors whenever he went to town for supplies. They all suspected something, but no one dared confront him. The weight of his guilt was unbearable. One evening, as the wind howled through the trees outside, Ethan sat in the living room, staring at the fire. He hadn't eaten in days, hadn't slept in longer. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling as he clutched the bottle of whiskey. The house was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. He hadn't seen Sarah's ghost in days, but the oppressive sense of her presence lingered like a shadow. Then, he heard it, a soft tapping at the window. Ethan froze, his breath hitching in his throat. Slowly, he turned his head toward the sound, and there she was. Sarah stood just outside the window, her pale face pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes staring straight at him. She didn't move, didn't speak, but the look on her face sent a chill down his spine. It was a look of knowing, of understanding. She knew what he had done, and she wasn't going to let him forget. Ethan leaped to his feet, the bottle of whiskey shattering on the floor. He backed away from the window, heart pounding in his chest. "Leave me alone," he screamed, his voice hoarse and desperate. "You're not real. You're dead. I killed you." Sarah's ghost didn't respond. She just continued to stare, unblinking, as if waiting for something. In a panic, Ethan rushed out of the house and into the cold night. He stumbled through the trees, the underbrush snagging at his clothes as he made his way to the spot where he had buried her. He had to see the grave, had to know she was still there, that he wasn't losing his mind completely. The moonlight barely illuminated the forest, casting eerie shadows on the ground as the wind whipped through the branches. When he reached the grave, his heart sank. The ground had been disturbed. The rocks and branches that had once covered the site were scattered, the earth beneath them dug up. The grave was empty. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his hands clawing at the dirt in disbelief. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "No, no, no." Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate. He turned, his heart hammering in his chest, and there she was, standing in the clearing, her figure bathed in moonlight. But something was different. This wasn't the ghostly figure he had been seeing for months. This was real. Sarah was alive. Ethan's mind raced, confusion and fear battling for dominance. How is this possible?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "Did you really think you killed me, Ethan?" she asked, her voice cold and sharp. "Did you really think you could just bury me and move on with your life?" Ethan shook his head, backing away from her. I don't understand. You were dead. I saw you weren't breathing." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "You didn't even bother to check, did you? You just assumed I was dead and buried me like an animal." Ethan's mind was reeling. All this time, he had been haunted by the ghost of his wife, but she hadn't been dead. She had been alive, buried in a shallow grave, and somehow, she had escaped. "I should have died that night," Sarah continued, her voice filled with venom. "But I didn't. And now, you're going to pay for what you did to me." Ethan scrambled to his feet, panic surging through him. "Sarah, please, I didn't mean to, I thought." "Save your excuses," she spat. "You were willing to kill me, and now you're going to suffer the same fate." Before Ethan could react, Sarah lunged at him. The force of her attack sent him sprawling to the ground, and he felt the cold steel of a knife press against his throat. He gasped, struggling against her, but she was stronger than he remembered, her rage fueling her strength. "I trusted you," she hissed, her face inches from his. "I loved you, and you tried to kill me." Ethan's vision blurred as he fought for breath, his mind racing with regret, fear, and the crushing realization that he had sealed his own fate. The cold bite of the knife pressed harder against his skin, and for a moment, he thought this was the end. But then, Sarah hesitated. She pulled the knife away, her breathing ragged, her eyes filled with a mix of hatred and something else, something softer. She stood over him, her chest rising and falling as she fought to regain control. "I should kill you," she whispered. "But death would be too easy for you. You don't deserve peace." With that, she stepped back, leaving Ethan gasping for air on the forest floor. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the night, leaving him alone in the cold, dark woods. Ethan lay there, staring up at the stars, his mind spinning. He had been tormented by her ghost, haunted by his guilt, and now the truth had come crashing down on him like a tidal wave. Sarah wasn't dead. But maybe, just maybe, she was more dangerous alive.